of refugees and other vulnerable populations. It's my pleasure to welcome both of them, and let's start off by having Dr. Najumi come to the stand. Thank you, Dr. Najumi.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. Can you please tell me how to operate the slides?
I think if you just...
This is this, or?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just as forward, just pushing each time? Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening. I would like to thank the director, staff, and the distinguished fellows at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Services for giving me the opportunity to be in front of you tonight. And tonight, I'm not talking on behalf of any government or institutions. The contents of my presentation is based on my own case studies, research, and my own direct observation. Indeed, I have used charts and illustrations that is produced by respected institutions. So the topic that I'm talking is, it is more than what you see in Wisconsin. Is going to be covered on a broader spectrum at the global level, and then come from there step by step to how it is relevant to you or to us in the United States. So this is the agenda of my presentation. In generally, I'll explain the global trend and how it's relevant to the United States, and also offer some remedial approaches to the crisis. In 2012, at the global level, we had only less than 50 million refugees, and these are mainly forcibly displaced individuals across the globe. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years, and by 2022, it has passed 100 million people. And within only 1 decade. The main causes of refugees are comprises mainly of 3 issues. One, it is the wars and geopolitical violence, gross violation of human rights, environmental degradation due to climate change. And as you see, this is the first time recorded history that we have such a overblown population or number of people that they have been forced out of their homes, towns, and villages. And unfortunately, we don't have a global approach, a global policy to handle that and mitigate. 50% of this population are children who are exposed to diverse level of trauma across conflict zones as well as destitute communities. Sorry, I have to look a little bit. I'll stand here. Where the refugees are coming from, this 100,000. And that 100,000 is minus the 12 million refugees being coming out of Ukraine. So if you look at the dark, highlighted dark blue, only a fraction of this population are seeking asylums. A teeny tiny fraction of this 100,000 or over 100,000 population, who they may or may not be resettled here in the United States or in Central European countries. The majority of refugees are resided in developing countries, neither in the United States nor in Europe, and ranging from Turkey to Ethiopia. Why it is connected to us and how it is relevant to the United States. If you look at, these are the 4 conflicts that the majority of the refugees in the world are coming from right now. In all these conflicts, the United States have been involved either directly or indirectly. And we have been given by successive administrations, whether under the control of Democrat or controlled by Democrats or Republicans, that there have been good causes for the international intervention into foreign wars and foreign conflicts. But if you look at the outcome of these 4 cases, for instance, and these are the top 4 generating refugees in the world, the outcome, it says otherwise. In all these countries, except in Ukraine, which is a different situation, we have supported regime change in support of the local population who wanted to have a regime change in these countries. But at the end, in the case of Syria, the Assad regime is still in power, and right now working on normalization with the regional country. It is the same in Venezuela, and it is in the case of Afghanistan, after 20 years of investment and presence in that country. Oh, thank you very much. Much better. Wow. So, when the United States withdrew forces from that country, the national government collapsed. The Taliban took over, the same people that we have removed from power in 2001. In addition to that, the Taliban seized about $83 billion worth of weapon systems that produced by us or provided by us. And billions more, hundreds of billions more investment in infrastructure and communication technologies that now they are under their control. And Afghanistan, again, is one of the hotbed of terrorist organizations and radical groups. So in the case of Ukraine, there are 2 narratives. In our side, from Washington and Brussels and European Union, we do believe that the Ukrainian war started with the Russian aggression. The Russian narrative and the Moscow allies is the otherwise. They are saying it is the United States pushed for the expansion of the European NATO toward the Eastern European country that provoked the Russian invasion. Regardless of these narratives, if you look at it, the number of people are suffering. In the case of Syria, 21 million population, over 14 million of the population are displaced or fled the country. In the case of Venezuela, we have 7 million fled the country, and more than 7 million are internally displaced. And in the case of Afghanistan, 2.6 million people fled the country, and about 3.6 million people are IDPs, or internal displaced persons. And 25 million people are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. And in the case of Ukraine, we have over 12 million, which wasn't included in that chart that I showed you at the beginning, refugees and internal displaced individuals, and the country is in ruin. And 18 million of the 40 million population are in dire need for humanitarian crisis assistance. So this is what happened to those indigenous population. What had happened to us on our side? The interfering in foreign wars and conflicts, even though it was started with a good intention and the bad outcome comes out of it, cost the United States tremendously financially. If you add the $2.2 trillion for the next 30 years for the veteran cares, for those who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, the the cost of these wars and these interventions is about $8 trillion. And so if you look at it, in the bottom of the chart, the budget of the Department of Defense, a department that I work with, has increased by $884 billion above the base in the last 20 years. So for this year, President Biden approved $885 billion for Department of Defense, $45 billion new security assistance for Ukraine. And then if you compare and contrast with all other key national departments and institutions, everybody is underfunded, and the bulk of resources are still going in the military expenditure. So, for instance, in the case of Department of State and USAID, these are the two important strategic arms of our foreign policies. They are understaffed, they are under-resourced, they are underfunded, so badly. And look at it, for instance, the Department of Education or Health and Human Services or the Small Business Administration that are so key for our local economy and helping the citizens and the communities. So in the long run, these wars, intervention and in wars and conflicts, put the federal government under $2 trillion worth of debt as of 2022. If we don't pay that, by 2030, we have to pay $2 trillion interest. By 2050, it reaches to $6.5 trillion. If you compare, to give you a comparative analysis, the budget of the state of Wisconsin is $660 billion a year. Of course, with 1.7 trillion reserve. The budget of the national government in the the federal government in the United States is 1.7 trillion for this year, 2003. How can we pay this? And the federal government borrowed money from internal resources that we have, mainly Social Security Fund, and also about 20% from foreign governments, including China. So when it comes to refugees, and it falls under the public policy rather than the foreign policy. And if you look at it, the United States has one of the most shining history of refugee resettlement in the world. The images that you see, these are iconic symbols of Americans who came to this country as refugees. From Albert Einstein to Madeleine Albright, the first woman secretary of the state, all the way to Steve Chen, the co-founder of YouTube, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, and Henry Kissinger in art and literature, great Santana in music, or Gloria Estefan, and so forth, so on. On the top left corner, Rear Admiral Nguyen, he was 5 years old in Vietnam, South Vietnam, when the entire his family were gunned down by the Vietcongs, and he was hit on the shoulder and leg, rescued by his uncle the last day before the fall of Saigon, airlifted to the United States. It resonates with what happened last year in Afghanistan and in Kabul. Right? So unfortunately, with all this shining history, our system has been very sluggish in order to achieve refugee resettlement. In 2003, Congress put a cap for 125,000 per year for resettlement. And even though at the time the number of refugees were below 50 million globally, and unfortunately, last year, the Biden administration could only resettle a little bit over 25,000, far below the 125,000 that the Congress has already allowed. And if you compare that with the European country, you see that France, Germany, and Spain is smaller than the United States with less resources. They were able successfully to resettle a larger number of refugees within their own countries. President Biden promised to we have about 100,000 refugees in the United States. That is the number that has been achieved at the end of the year, 1,610. The case of Afghanistan, it is a special type of case. We have mainly veteran groups, civil society, churches, and many others got together and airlifted about 120,000. This is one of the biggest since Saigon, the fall of Saigon. About 67,000 landed in the United States, but unfortunately without any pre-planning or providing sources or providing communication for these people, and they just dropped them in various different communities, and then you are now facing here in Warsaw that they need the communities to really help them. So, and there are about 70,000 more waiting for a special immigration visa. I doubt that they're going to get that, given the situation in Afghanistan. There is no way that anybody can approve it until approve them or vet them before they come, until there is a new plan or new program is established. So we, as a nation, citizens, we have civic accountability and responsibility that hold us morally and strategically responsible for what's going on in what has caused this refugee crisis. If you take an aerial picture of a healthy democracy, you will see that a democratic society comprised of three components, which is the civil society and the citizen and their participation in the political process, which is the biggest portion, yeah? And then you have public sector and the private sector. In reality, this governance by the people and for the people. By the people are the civil societies and the citizen. And for the people, it is the job of the government to regulate, mainly manage and control the public sector to serve the common good. In this refugee crisis that we are saying, it has to be, we must bring that to the public space. In public space, it is an area where genuine leaders are coming forward. No, it's been too far. So the moral obligation that we have is based on our commitment to the 1950 Refugee Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And all the laws in the land that dealing with the refugees and the resettlement has to consistent with these commitments. So it is not only the state, it is not only the federal government. Communities, institutions, and citizens, they have their own role and obligations to deal with the situation and be aware of it, inform themselves, and in order to make it easier for these new arrivals, our new neighbors into our communities. So, of course, healthy citizens are coming out or arising from healthy communities. And if we don't really build the needed infrastructure for the new arrivals, it is very difficult to claim that we are a healthy community and healthy society. And indeed, civil society and other organizations, like the one forum that we had today at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Services, that different component of the state, different component of the society and the city coming together in order to finding common ground resolution are absolutely essential. So this is my last slide. At the strategic responsibility of the citizen, we are a connected world now. We cannot stay alone and run away from this kind of problem, that we are also part of the problem. So we need to, as a nation, find a way, a different alternative when it comes to foreign policy, rather than engaging in these conflicts and wars. At the end, after all this $1 trillion of investment, the outcome hasn't been desirable. And that is a lesson that every citizen has to hold their elected representative accountable. They need to come to their town and explain and answer your questions. For instance, in the case of Afghanistan, how it could collapse suddenly? Didn't we know anything about it? How many times the leadership came to your town, or the elected of representatives? Those who are funding, borrowing money from key institutions and from even foreign governments to bankroll some of the engagement that we have across the world. So we need to find mechanism to prefer cooperation over confrontation, and also find measures or support. Measures are there, support efforts to reduce this geopolitical violence in the form of conflict management, peace building, peace development, and so forth, so on. On the top of that, it is so important we cooperate with our rivals. Many of these conflicts, either the Chinese or the Russians are involved in it. We need to compete and be rival. At the meantime, we have to keep the line of communication open in area of diplomacy and area of shared common purposes to reduce the number of these conflicts. And so at the local level, state to state to, and also we have, for instance, on the European side, massive amount of experience that they have on handling this crisis. We need mechanism to let this side of Atlantic to communicate to the other side of Atlantic in order to learning lesson and maximizing our ability and effort in order to handle. So when you look at the global level, sustainable development is key essential ingredient that we can offer to the world. And we have the resources. It is in our vested interest, and it serves our national security interests in many different regions. The top 4 countries that providing and contributing to the sustainable development are these. Unfortunately, the United States from 2001 until now, came down to now it is ranked 41, somewhere between Cuba and Bulgaria. So, as a community, as a nation, we are morally obligated to question our representative when they legislate and fund the militarization of the foreign policy. While we can contribute, think about $8 trillion, we could have supported the Latin American countries to prevent the massive influx of migrants. We could have done very differently in many of those countries that the refugees are coming from. So these are, at the end of the day, you are the one that governing, and the government is serving you or serving us in general. Thank you very much. I end here and pass the floor to my co-panelists. You don't want this? Yeah,
I'll see what, but I'll give you this, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Can I have the clicker?
Yeah.
All right, can you hear me? No? Not now? How about now? Oh, great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Just when I think I know a lot about refugee resettlement and the humanitarian crisis, I realize how little I know, because there's just so much that I've learned tonight, and so thank you very much. That was very powerful. Thank you, WASA, for having me again. I am so glad to be here. I was just thinking about it and reflecting on the fact that almost 2 years ago was when I received a call from Mayor Rosenberg, Senator Baldwin's office as well as Pastor Voss and her team, and to say, hey, WASA is ready to welcome new neighbors. And that was music to my ears. And how do we do that? Let's assess if we're really ready, what our neighbors think about that, how do we engage community? And here we are, almost 2 years later. We have Multicultural Community Center and Adam and his team who are doing amazing work. Quite a few individuals have been welcomed already and quite a few on the way. Just so very proud of how far we've come. And I have to tell you that I often go to DC and to a lot of meetings with federal and national and state and local partners, and I always bring up WASA. So if your ears are ringing, it's probably me telling all the people in power about all the great work that is being done in WASA. So thanks for having me again. Thank you, WIPS, for inviting me, and thank you for letting me share a little bit of my perspective and a little bit of state perspective and kind of painting a picture of how we do things and how everything that my colleague here has talked to you about really is demonstrated on a local level. So let's try to do that. And then just forewarning, I do have a lot of slides. I may not stop on every single one of them. This is just a presentation I probably have done it about 200 times over the last year and a half or so. And so if you have questions afterwards, we can address them. But you already heard my name, Bojana Zoric Martinez. I have two roles. I work as the director of the Bureau of Refugee Programs within the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. Probably one of the most amazing teams, made up of a lot of refugees and people of different backgrounds and people who have worked overseas, helping others who needed help the most. And I also serve as the Wisconsin State Refugee Coordinator. So I get to bring my chair to a lot of people in power in DC and other areas who are, I'm learning, listening to what we have to say. So very proud of that. And then every state in the United States that actively resettles refugees has a designated state refugee office that coordinates refugee resettlement for that state, and for Wisconsin, that is the Bureau of Refugee Programs. And then every state has a designated state refugee coordinator who's the point person in the face of resettlement, and I have the honor and the privilege of serving in that role for almost 6 years, actually, two weeks shy of that. I started my role 4 days prior to the first executive order on refugees, also known as Muslim ban or refugee ban in 2017. So it's been baptism by fire ever since, and it's been quite a ride, but I think we're doing good. My team at DCF receives federal funding from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services. And then we contract with some 30 or so partners across the state who provide direct services to refugees. So we do not work directly with refugees, but we oversee those who do. We make sure everything's in compliance and refugees are getting what they need. I'm of a belief that anyone in my state is also my responsibility from the refugee backgrounds. Now, I don't know what happens behind the closed doors in people's homes. I can't control that, but every resource that is available out there that they're eligible for, they should get from my point of view. So just very briefly, who are refugees? Refugees are people who are persecuted or fear persecution based on some of those different criteria that have been defined by the United States, religion, race, nationality, and so on. One important thing to remember is that refugees, by U.S. definition, are those who have already come to the United States with refugee status, meaning when they put their foot on the American soil, they already have all the rights just like you and I do. Although I will say, and I was told you need to say this every time you talk, is that I am also of a refugee background. I came to the U.S. back in 1999 from former Yugoslavia as a refugee, and went through my own path of resettlement where I didn't speak a word of English. I didn't know anything about the American culture outside of 90210, which is so true. For those of you who've ever watched Beverly Hills 90210, so true. As soon as I landed in Wisconsin, I realized that was true. Not. So then I worked in refugee resettlement for a number of years, doing a lot of things that, again, Adam and his team and New Beginnings and Multicultural Community Center and others are doing, being hands-on and providing everything and anything that refugees needed. Just imagine, as I just mentioned in the interview with Channel 9, just imagine just being kind of ripped from your home and being placed somewhere else where you don't know anything and have nothing on you but clothes on your back. So everything that these individuals who provide direct services to refugees do, my hat's off to you, because I know how it is. Anyhow, my colleague spoke a little bit about the numbers. These are the numbers by UNHCR given in 2022, I believe. Or you probably see it better than I do. About 90 million people are displaced across the world. 30 million of them have that refugee designation, and again, half of them are children. Now think about this. Only 1%, under 1% actually, of all world refugees actually get to immigrate to a country of their choosing or a country that will accept them. Less than 1%. So those who are here are lucky. I am lucky. My family's lucky because we made it. IDP means, in case you're wondering, internally displaced people. So there's a lot of people who are displaced within their own country. Where am I? Okay, so what rights, what options do they have? Voluntary repatriation to the country where they immigrated from. Well, a lot of Ukrainians are thinking they're going to be going back. So when things calm down, I'm going to go back. Will that be the case? We don't know. But in some cases, that happens. Permanent resettlement in a neighboring country. So for example, for those of you who might be familiar with how former Yugoslavia looked way back then, there were 6 different republics, but then when the war started, they all separated, they all became their own countries. And so I immigrated from Bosnia and went to Serbia, and that's where, and at that time it was a different country. So one of the things that I could have done, had I had better opportunities there, could have stayed there. Because I gained refugee status in that country. But my dad had the American dream, and he thought that he belonged in the U.S. Questionable, very questionable some days. I'm kidding, but he's doing very well. He's great. He wanted to come to the United States, and we were like, who's waiting for you there? And so he applied, and there were 4 different countries who were accepting refugees at that time that we could apply through the International Organization for Migration, and one of them was New Zealand, I think Canada and Australia, and then US, and we applied, and there it was. So I talked about refugees, but we often say refugees, but it's not just refugees who are served under our programs. It is asylees and victims of trafficking and Cuban Haitian entrants and certain Amerasians from Vietnam, and now most recently Afghans and Ukrainians. I'm sure you've heard of Operations Allies Welcome and all the involvement that we have with Fort McCoy, and then with the resettlement of Afghans not only in Wausau but across the state. In federal fiscal year 2022, and I think I'm going to talk about that as well, we welcomed some 868 Afghans, some from Fort McCoy, some from the other military bases that have found homes in Wisconsin. So how does it work? I have a colleague who loves to do this, and I hate to click through it, but here it is. You can't really read too much of that, but those of you that can, it really works. Where overseas, so I gave my example of being a refugee from Bosnia, going to Serbia, applying to get to, going through the application process. It usually takes about 2 years for regular refugee resettlement, in case you didn't know. And then you have all kinds of United States refugee program interviews and vetting, and I'll show you in a bit 9 different U.S. agencies do vetting background and criminal background, health background, and those types of things. checking before somebody's actually authorized to come to the United States. You know, when Operations Allies Welcome started and we started welcoming people at Fort McCoy, I received hundreds of calls from all over, and the number one question was, the most common question was, are these people vetted? And so that is very much, again, what a lot of people are asking. They are very, very much vetted, and I will show you in a minute, like a list of all the different agencies who are doing the vetting. But pretty much what happens is once a family goes through the application process and they go through a number of interviews and screenings, then they are approved and their case is then by an overseas processing center referred to the Department of State, Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, who then works with 9 different national VOLEGs or resettlement agencies to figure out where they're going to be placed. And so, for example, in my case, they asked during that process if we had any friends or family in the United States, and we didn't. So my dad said, no, place us anywhere. Because a lot of times they will ask that because integration is much better, self-sufficiency becomes much quicker if you know somebody in the area. That they become you lean on them more and they help you in many ways. And so we didn't, and they placed us in Milwaukee, and there was, but anyhow, so then the resettlement agencies are working amongst themselves to decide as to what's the best placement and which one of the organizations will be involved and how things will work from there. The next slide really is pretty much the same as the first, so I'm not going to focus on that too much, but some of this material can also be available for you in case you are interested. So here's that slide that I told you about, the 9 different agencies who are doing the vetting before the refugees can come here. And so refugees are amongst the most vetted immigration group that comes to our country. One of the things that I think is important to say is the process is so rigorous that let's say, there's a health screening that needs to be done for TB and some of the other communicable diseases, and that's good for 6 months, and then in case the rest of the process is not continuing within the 6 months, it has to go back. So the process is just very long. So who resettles refugees? So as I said, there's 9 different, 10 actually, because we just there was just a new resettlement agency that was added to the mix, and then there's going to be one more. But 10 different national resettlement organizations, and I haven't updated the slide, so forgive me for that, but I'll mention them. And these are the resettlement agencies who have their local affiliates. So in your case, there's Ethiopian Community Development Council, who is the national organization, so the National VOLEG or the National Resettlement Agency, but then the Multicultural Community Center is actually a local affiliate of that national agency. So that's the relationship. So ECDC is one of the 9, and then MCC is a local affiliate that's actually doing resettlement. So every case is then referred to one of these 9 organizations, and then they work amongst themselves. And so Adam, for example, and his team will receive what's called a biodata sheet, and they'll say, okay, a family from, Somalia, a family of 7 from Somalia is coming, and usually information's limited on there's some information, but not really as much as our case managers would benefit from, I feel sometimes, right? So there's their language, religion, ages, if there are any specific disabilities or complex medical needs and things like that, that will be listed. But otherwise, that's it. And then so when Adam receives this biodata, he gathers his team, I assume, and say, okay, this is what we have. How do you guys feel? Do we have housing available? Are we going to be okay if we assure this family? It's called assurance. And then they say to ECDC, yep, we're going to take this family. We feel pretty confident that we can take them and we're going to serve them well. And they sign this sheet, they send it back, and the clock starts ticking. They start working with New Beginnings and all the other volunteers. Some of them I see here in the room. And they start getting things ready, setting up apartments and doing everything else that needs to be done to make it a home for the new neighbor. These are the 9 different national organizations, so I can tell you who they are in Wisconsin. once we go. So these are the 9, but then in Wisconsin, again, my colleague who loves to do this stuff, we have the USCRI. Their local affiliate is the International Institute of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. If you've heard of Holiday Folk Fair International, they also do that, so that's that organization. We also have Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan in Milwaukee, so those are the 2 in Milwaukee. We have Catholic Charities in Green Bay, Jewish Social Services in Madison, who am I forgetting? World Relief in the Fox Valley area, and then the newest and mighty, small but mighty, Multicultural Community Center under ECDC here in Wausau. So who's arrived? Some of the numbers and graphs and pictures you've already seen, but here's something that I think is worth mentioning. Every year, the president, in consultation with Congress, sets a ceiling for how many arrivals we're going to get. The blue line is the ceiling. Is it? Are you better seeing that, or am I? So the blue line is the ceiling, and then orange is the actual. So you can tell that in many years, that really followed. But then you can see 9/11 happening, right? And the line dipping, and then going back up. And then you can see the beginning of the previous administration and how things were affected. And then, of course, COVID had a lot to do with it as well, but definitely the program was close to being gutted under the previous administration and is now starting to go back up again. In terms of the numbers, Wisconsin, I can tell you this, Wisconsin has never been a leader as it relates to numbers. We're always kind of in the middle, 25th place, somewhere in there, as for arrivals. But in terms of effective programming and close collaboration within our state and partners, we are definitely getting up there. This is the 2022, so FY, meaning October 1st through September 30th, October 1st, 21 to September 30th of 2022. This is how many arrivals we had. This is refugees. This does not include Afghans. So the total refugee resettlement that includes the Afghan population and the regular refugee process population is 1554. So we're 868 and 686 or something like that. But I can tell you that in over the years, this is what numbers look like. So you can tell that in federal fiscal year 2016, I believe we're somewhere around 1,700 or so, and then those numbers just went down from there. And that has a lot to do with, again, that ceiling that was set and the number of arrivals that were allowed in the country from the refugee countries. Ceiling is now set for 125,000. However, it takes time to rebuild capacity overseas. Remember those processing centers we talked about and where I went for an interview and all that? That's also almost was gutted because of the policies that came from Washington, but that has slowly started to rebuild, and so it will take time to get up there. But the ceiling is currently set at 125,000. Will we get there? Probably not, but we're definitely working towards that number. Oh, I forgot to mention SIVs. You're probably wondering what that means. Those are special immigrant visa holders. So 20 years ago, a program was put forward. So it was after 9/11 for people from Afghanistan and Iraq who worked with the American government overseas. They were in return given the opportunity to immigrate to the United States with their family. So when Taliban took over last year, or God, it's been a year and a half, August of 2021, we knew that there were going to be people who already entered the SIV process who might not have been able to finish it. And so those were the people that were brought here as part of the Operations Allies Welcome. But some of them, again, have already started this special immigrant visa program. And so those are the arrivals through the special immigrant visa program. I mentioned the Operations Allies Welcome. You probably know there were 8 different military bases that housed the Afghans. We were the biggest base here in Wisconsin. We're also the base that everyone even today talks about when you talk about best practices. We didn't think about it at the time because we thought everything was going wrong, especially within the first few weeks. But I can tell you that Fort McCoy really, truly led the effort with the federal agencies, of course, at the realm, but a lot of local partners, a lot of you and community members have stepped forward with all kinds of things, from donations to volunteering to just many. We received such an outpour of support that it was just incredible to see. Hundreds of calls offering homes. I was just mentioning at dinner, some of the most powerful calls that I've received in my role, or as long as I've worked in refugee resettlement, formally or later as a volunteer, was when I received calls from vets who would say, I am looking for so-and-so. They saved my life overseas. And I'm willing to move out of my house to offer him, in one case it was her as well, and their family room. I will figure it out, but they need safety, and they provided me with safety, and now it's my turn. That was very powerful. That tells who we are. So I'm not going to talk about too much of programming. I'm going to make sure that there is time for questions because I'm sure you have some. But I mentioned earlier that the Bureau of Refugee Program receives this federal funding that we are then act as a pass-through entity for the service providers. Under the Operations Allies Welcome, the programming has really expanded. And so there was this program called APA, which is the Afghan Placement Assistance Program. You may know that when refugees come, there's this intense first 30 to 90 days where everything kind of must be done, right? Too short, we all agree. Nonetheless, we can't get away from it. It is that first 90 days that is crucial. And so then, based on that program called Reception and Placement, the federal government built the APA, what we call program, to help with the Afghans for that first 90 days post-resettlement. So first 90 days after they would leave a base. I have to tell you this. I was in D.C. last month, and at Fort McCoy, I met a woman who was a number of women who were women's rights activists here. And for whatever reason, nobody wanted to stay in Wisconsin. I don't know why, but nobody wanted to. I'm kidding. They went to Virginia, and she now works for the university there, doing a lot of women's rights research and a lot of kind of looking back on Afghanistan and what happened there. And so she hosted me for dinner, and she invited a number of her friends who were doing the same thing. And we had a nice conversation, but we met at Fort McCoy, and she talked to me about the impact that the welcoming in our state had on their further path, right? And how supported and welcome they felt. So that was great. And then I was walking around Capitol because between the events, and there was these 4 guys that were standing there trying to take a picture. And one of them says to me, ma'am, and I'm like, oh God. He goes, can you take a picture of us? And I'm thinking, yes. And I said, where are you from? And they said, Afghanistan. And I thought, oh, great. So I started a conversation with them and told them about Fort McCoy. And one of them says, Barrack 2058. I was there. And I'm like, oh my God. So was I. I came to visit many times. And so it's really great to connect with people that are coming here and to hear their stories and to hear how much it meant for them when we opened our doors and our arms to their needs, and just listening, it just means the world. Anyhow, again, my colleague mentioned the war in Ukraine. As you all know, what was it, February 23rd here, 24th overseas of last year when we received the call that Ukraine was invaded and that, what do we do now? And of course, anything that happens overseas or on the border, we're the first to get a call to say, what do we do? What do we do? Where do we go? How do we help? Or what's going to happen with these people? And so the federal government put together a program called Uniting for Ukraine and promised to resettle about 100,000 Ukrainians in the United States through a program that will now match their relatives here in the United States. So their relatives, their friends, people who knew Ukrainians overseas could put together this affidavit of financial support, vouching that they were support them once they're here. And so that expedited some 100,000 Ukrainians who've already come here, and the program is still ongoing. And then that expanded to offering to anyone who might not know people overseas in Ukraine, but who still wanted to help. And so that program, again, is still ongoing. Number of programs that we have. And these are not, when you think about it, oh my God, that's a lot of programs, that's a lot of money. Some of them are pretty small. Adam and I talked about that earlier, but there's still some support, and there's been more growing support for both Afghans and the Ukrainians. Self-sufficiency, well-being, employment, and community connectedness are really the goals of the programs. I will tell you that over the years, resettlement program really was all about employment. Resettlement program, all about employment. It's all about the numbers, because numbers will show, how many people are getting, how many people are serving, and in return, we're going to get this much funding. Well, especially in the last 10 years, I think we've been changing that to look at the whole family and that holistic approach. I know that's a popular word, but it's real. And not just thinking about the employable adults, but thinking about the entire family, because the adult cannot be successful if their child is not where they need to be. So thinking about that and looking at programming that will encompass all those things has really been something that we've been focusing on. A lot of people ask me about unaccompanied refugee minors, because there's a lot of minors out there that may not have a family. And so, unfortunately, Wisconsin does not have a formal unaccompanied refugee minor program. There is an occasion where minors are joining their relatives, like their grandparents or aunts and uncles, and in that case, it goes through like the regular foster care program. But for the most part, we don't have the program like some of the states. Like Michigan, for example, has the largest in the entire country unaccompanied minor program. And I will say this, that because I forgot to mention the 10th resettlement, National Resettlement Agency, that's Bethany Christian Services. They've been involved a lot in an accompanied refugee minor space, and now they're the affiliate, or they're the national. And numbers, there's a number of ways to help. I left this slide up because I know in a lot of presentations that we do, people ask, what can I do to help? And these are some of the ways, but most importantly, supporting the infrastructure that's already there and building off of that. So volunteering with the agency that resettles people is really key, and asking them as to how they can be supported. We have a number of volunteers who mean well, but sometimes the intent does not match the impact. And so we want to make sure, and I know that MCC is really trying to coordinate the efforts so that people are not duplicating things, but are working in continuation with one another, and that's really important. So when first the Operations Allies Welcome happened, a lot of people asked, like, well, what do I do? How do I donate? Or how do I, give my time? And I think working with the local resettlement agency is key. Now, we don't only work with the resettlement agencies, we work with a number of different organizations, health departments, clinics, health and mental health providers, school districts, ESL providers, those who provide services to older refugees, citizenship. I mean, there's a whole array of things. I mean, think about just what it would take for somebody to become self-sufficient. And so that's really one of the things that, again, is important to highlight, is if people want to help, they should work with their local resettlement agency. And that should do it. I am so proud of the fact that I didn't get to red light, only to yellow, because I can talk. But I think it's time for questions. So I'll take a seat, turn on the mic, and we can take questions. Right, Neymat? Thank you.
So we do have a question from an online viewer. This is from Frank. There are a small number of citizens that believe that refugees are given the right to vote. Can you clarify this? Please also discuss availability of medical assistance, Medicare, and Social Security.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Frank, was it Frank? Excellent. Thank you, Frank, for the question. No, refugees cannot vote until they're citizens. A year after a refugee enters the country, they're eligible to apply for their permanent residency, also known as green card. And then once they apply for that, they get their permanent residency, they're permanent resident. But then 4 years and 6 months after entering the country, they are also eligible to apply for citizenship. That usually takes 6 months to a year. I'm not gonna, don't quote me on that. I know it's different. USCIS is pretty overwhelmed these days, but they usually after 5 years they gain their citizenship, and it is only after they have citizenship that they can register to vote and then vote. As for the eligibility for the other programs that you've mentioned, Frank, refugees are eligible for a TANF program, so W-2, Wisconsin Works in our state for families. And that is a cash assistance. And again, there's a number of activities, employment and employability activities that are tied to that. So they have to participate in those in order to be able to receive those benefits. If they are an unmarried couple or single people without children, they're eligible for what's called refugee cash assistance, which it mirrors the TANF side or W-2, and that goes for up to 8 months. And again, there's a number of activities tied to that as well. As for medical assistance, they're eligible for the most part, for Badger Care in our state as Wisconsin Medicaid, and that also goes for the first 8 months. A lot of people ask about, different breaks that refugees get. I can tell you that refugees in the process of coming to the United States have to sign a paper through the International Organization for Migration promising that 6 months after entering the country, they're going to start paying off their airfare tickets. So that's the extent of that. I mean, there's everything that you and I are eligible for, they're eligible for in terms of like unemployment benefits if they're working and things like that. But they're also obligated to pay for everything that you and I are. I hope that answers your question, Frank.
Is there talks to continue that, or what's the status of that?
What did I do? There are talks to continue the efforts. That's all I know. Thank you.
Numbers floating around in my head, but see, 100 million refugees. Tell me, how does the? I'm not sure I understand sort of the migrants at our southern border. Some are refugees, some are not. We also have workers. Kind of help me sort of understand that situation. And we obviously have a lot coming into Wisconsin, and some are. Anyway, help me sort of fold into some of that kind of, maybe it's regular migration, but they're not refugees. Help sort that out for me, can you?
Sure. Under the Geneva Convention and the 1950 Refugee Convention that we are committed, is it on? Oh. And the Universal Declaration of, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are a specific definition when it comes to refugees or migrants or whatever. But the key point here that we talk about, that 100 million, and now it is over 100 million. These are forcibly displaced individuals. That they come, they are, and we, in our area of work, whoever leaves their countries because of fear of persecution or whatever reason they are fleeing, they called refugees. But my colleague has mentioned within the US legal system, refugee means whoever is being vetted and came here, and that person is a legal resident, which is a different definition. Migrants are part of these 100 million people. And unfortunately, the reality is that as we continue the way we have been continuing in the last 20 years, and bankrolling some of these involvement in these conflicts or wars, and as people are running, they have to run somewhere, those who survive. Turkey cannot hold anymore. The EU pays Turkey to a certain extent, and pays to Cyprus and Greece and to a certain extent. There are millions of refugees in Iran, millions of refugees in Pakistan, across Latin America, across different parts of Africa. And it goes back to the very simple fact. The world is now regional. Even the United States by itself alone, this mighty nation cannot survive. We are a part of North American agreement, and we have trade agreement, we have many different relationships. So in order to manage those at the border or rushing to the border, southern border, we have to work at the regional level within the Latin American region. And in order to, this is what I mentioned about the investment in sustainable development. So these people stay there or they go back there. Millions of refugees that are in the developing countries, the absolute majority, they want to go back. But there is no condition to go back. There is not home to go back. So this is an area that we need to really hold our elected official accountable. And when it comes to foreign policy, we need to come to international assistance and humanitarian assistance and so forth, so on. So I hope I can clear a little bit. On the technical area, I think you should add a little.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to clarify, and I really appreciate that question. And I appreciate it because I personally feel that every conversation should start with the definition. Because I think we're using these terms interchangeably, and it's not always right, because we're showing these numbers and then we're saying this, and then so it's mixed messages, right? And so it's important to clarify that. So I mentioned the number of 90 million. My colleague mentioned 100 million. My numbers are from federal fiscal year. His are probably updated. And so we're somewhere there, right? But these are people who are displaced in the world, meaning they can be displaced for different reasons and in different countries. But that does not mean, by US definition, that they got refugee status. 30 million people were like me, where I left my home country, went to the neighboring country, and gained refugee status. And so then when you think about the US definition, who we talk about as refugees, as pointed out, are those people who are vetted, who went through the United States refugee application process, and then we're given the paper. When they come here, they have residency and they have legal status. So those are refugees. When we say refugees, we really mean that. And then I'm not going to go more on the southern border, but I think there's different definitions that have been used by media, by even service providers, by the federal government, but just so many different entities that I work with that, and I'm even confused as to what people mean. So you're going to hear things like migrants, immigrants, refugees. You're going to hear refugees as well. You're going to hear all kinds of things. And so I think it's an important thing to remember that immigrants are all of these different groups. Refugees are immigrants as well, but not every immigrant is a refugee. So I apologize on behalf of all the people that are confusing you. They're confusing me too. Thank you.
Just a friendly reminder, if you have a question, please keep your hand raised until the microphone gets to you before you ask. Thank you.
Thank you. So I work with a lot of Hispanic community here, and we have a growing Nicaraguan community, Venezuelan community. But prior to that, the largest group still remains the Mexican community. And I know that you would probably definitely open doors to help people. But how is it that people from Mexico, with all the problems there's there by government, prosecution, human rights and everything, are not classified as or can apply for a refugee status? And that creates a problem even here, because the people of that community that are here today feel very shunned that different communities coming in and they are having benefits to which they have been here 15, 20 years. I'm not saying it's not good, but you can imagine how they feel.
Completely. I get this question a lot. In fact, when the Uniting for Ukraine started, I got a lot of calls that says, wait a minute, like, are these people are coming here within weeks, and my family's been waiting overseas in a refugee camp forever. So I get that. I completely understand. So you cannot gain refugee status once you are in the United States. And that's really, that's the simplest answer to that. Once you're in the United States, you can apply for asylum, but refugees gain refugee status overseas and they already come here with refugee status. If somebody's crossing the border, or if somebody's from Mexico or some of the other countries, they're crossing the border and they're on the US soil, they cannot apply for refugee status. By US definition, they cannot be refugees. A lot of the individuals will then apply for asylum. Now, asylum takes, you probably know this, it takes like a couple of years for processing, right? And while they're in the process for asylum, unless you're a pregnant woman or a child under 18 who may be qualified under an extended Medicaid program, you're not eligible for anything. You are not eligible for any benefits. You can't even work. And so that's where the issues we see are the most. And that's what we're seeing now is issues with the communities that are coming up, Nicaraguans and Venezuelans and some of the others. And so recently, 24,000 Venezuelans were allowed to come here in a similar program to Uniting for Ukraine, where they could have sponsors, meaning a relative can sponsor them and sponsor the process while they're here. They can sponsor them, and then they can be kind of living with them and off of them for the processing time. It is an issue. I know it's an issue. We receive more and more calls, and we see everything that's going on. Unfortunately, the policies that we are, seeing nowadays do not allow for these populations to be eligible for services and benefits. And so they're not eligible for programs under the Office of Refugee Resettlement, those employment and employability programs that refugees, asylees, SIVs, victims of trafficking, and others are.
I'm learning so much as you answer questions. So that brings to mind, how do the potential refugees in the other countries, in Europe, in Central and South America, learn the procedures that are required to become, they just Google it? Because that's everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I have the opportunity to work with on the subject within European Union. They have various different mechanisms in order to, even there is a general rules that have been sanctioned by the European Parliament, but each country has also its own different sets of regulations. First of all, they have a quota system. When the refugee comes in a big number, each country gets their own share, and some of them, especially across the Eastern European nations, they reject to do so. When it comes to integration, every one of these countries do have a program called integration, and they have many ways to even have classes on cultural issues for women, for children, and they tell, for instance, education is compulsory here in either in Germany or in France or any of the Scandinavian countries. And you cannot, you're responsible to send your kid to school every day. If the kid doesn't show at school, the police will go after them. And when it comes to protection and enforcement of children's rights, this is a huge issue, and they take it very seriously. They remove children from the parents that abuse their children. And there are many different institutions, especially civil society, are pretty active in cooperating and working with the federal and state and local governments. In the case of, for instance, Germany, they have Department of Families. And it is like an national administration that the care of the children across the country, regardless they are citizens or refugees, falls under the obligation of this department. And they intervene, and they have so many different components, and even the police is trained to handle refugees and refugee cases. So and when it comes to health care or access to health, in the case of, for instance, Ukrainian refugee and their influx, sudden influx into European countries, they're all assigned to a healthcare provider and insurance that a doctor can use that code, and automatically it will be charged and paid for the services that they're providing to the newly arrival refugees. So they have set up a systematic, step-by-step plan when they come in from screening. For instance, in the case of communicable diseases, tuberculosis or whatever it is there, they check it very quick, and they have full access to healthcare. And there is children benefit in the form of, they call it Kindergeld in Germany, or child money. All refugee children are eligible to that. It's about almost 200 euro per child. So these systems are built into, and these are not like new, a little bit older, but they added many more measures in order to accommodate and make the transition smoother to the local population. The language courses all free for refugees regardless of their status, and all they can attend. Enrollment into schools are all provided, and including enrollment into colleges, which is tuition free.
And I just want to add, that is very helpful. I'm learning a lot too, but there's refugee processing centers all over. And a lot of them are strategically placed in the areas where there's close proximity to the affected areas where refugees are. And so, for example, in my case, I used my own example of going from Bosnia to Serbia, and in Serbia, in Belgrade, there was the International Organization for Migration office. And everyone knew that office was there. And so if you wanted to apply, you go there and you apply. And so it was and this was before cell phones, I mean, the access, but there is I can tell you refugees are survivors, as was said in that video. They're very resourceful. They will learn from one another, and it spreads like fire. And so phones do help a lot. A lot of them use apps like WhatsApp and Viber and so on. And again, the world travels fast, faster than you can imagine. We heard at Fort McCoy that, people in Afghanistan already knew what was happening. It was like, oh my God, how quickly. And so, so those are, yes, very, very Googleable. That's not even a word, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It was really great. One of the things that strikes me when we talk about how we interact with our lawmakers and the people we elect and putting that pressure on there, it strikes me that right now we seem to be in a period of extreme nationalism, and it doesn't necessarily matter which side of the aisle you're on. You're seeing it on both sides. And I guess, and I'm sure you don't have a magic wand, but if you do, I would love to hear about how do we have conversations about exploring how our interactions with the world can benefit us and keep us safer abroad, so we can cut down on the war spending, but also invite people into our world in a way that's meaningful for all of us.
I'm just going to say one thing, and then I know how passionate you are about this topic. Refugee resettlement used to be a bipartisan non-issue. Non-issue. Everyone was on the same page that refugees were a great asset to our communities in many ways. Culture, cuisine, language, the whole it takes a village type thing, and economy. Oh my God, refugees give back tenfold in so many ways. They are best employees, they retain their jobs, they don't quit on their jobs, they're persistent, they make workplaces much better. And so that's all I'm gonna say is, like, it used to be a non-issue, and then suddenly, within the last 10 years or so, we're starting to see the divide. So go ahead, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mayor. There are so much to learn from others, and also offer our lesson learned to others. In the case of Europe, for instance, I was visiting the community policing, and they have a number of different programs. And there was a survey in Germany, and the question was that who are the most trusted and respected profession in the country? Number one were medical doctors. Number two were the police. I said, it doesn't make sense how it is possible. And these are the ones that forcing people to do certain things, giving you tickets when you drive fast, and so forth, so on. The training to communicate with citizens, especially it considered a part of their job. And people are not afraid of law enforcement. And law enforcement is not really militarized, the level that we have in the United States. And these are individuals who are trained, and it is not easy to become a police officer. They have to go through many different cultural and civic education in order to put the uniform and come out and do their job. So when it comes to communication, they use many different means. For instance, for the coming refugees, churches are very active and very closely working with the different state agencies in order to understand their community. When I went in Belgium, for instance, or in France, and there are neighborhoods that nobody speaks the national language. You think you're in a different country. It is similar to some of our Chinatowns in different parts of the United States. But the authority, the national authority, for instance, in the city of Paris or in Berlin, and they know what's going on, and there is a significant cooperation with various different ethnic groups, either they are Turks or the Kurds or Afghans or Arabs or Moroccans or Africans. There is a system that is being set, and they try to mobilize and have that kind of communication. And even in the United States, as I work in the city of New Haven, in the city of Hartford. In the city of Hartford, I was involved in a actually mediation between the police and the people that we call them organized crime, in order to make the streets safe. In New Haven, I work with the youth community development through Yale University. I was a student at the time at Yale. And we visited the juvenile center, and the youngest that I interviewed was 12 years old and was arrested for auto theft. And he and 4 others, they were stealing cars, were arrested in India. When you sit with them, after a moment, you really forget that these are the innocent one who is the guilty one. So when it comes to refugees and the refugee population, when they come here, and even today we had the discussion that we have ethnic groups here in Wisconsin, and they are within their own communities. That is a normal thing when you go many different places. But if you treat each other or treat these communities and minority according to the Constitution, it doesn't matter who speaks what within their own families or within even their own communities, as far as they are believe in the Constitution and believe in the rule of law, and then want to have a healthy community. So communication, there are massive amount of experience across the Atlantic, and we are hoping at WIPS have programs to establish the citizen dialogue across the Atlantic and also across the United States in order to learn better lessons and inform policymakers and those who are in the position of bringing changes.
I would add, Mayor, you have the power. And your power is really in that communication, is to educate other mayors, to educate other local officials about your experience and experiences of your community, to open their doors and their arms to others. One thing that came as a silver lining from the executive order under President Trump that had to do with obtaining consents from local officials. So we had to obtain written consents from local officials within our state to allow to resettle refugees in their municipalities. And we all went crazy because we thought it was the craziest thing in the world. How dare he? And then I thought about it, and then I thought, while the enforcement of this is not what I would prefer, the idea is right. The local officials really need to be educated on who's coming into their communities, not because they can control it, stop it, whatever, but if we educate them about all the benefits that these communities are bringing, they're gonna be more on board to walk the walk with us and help us and support us. And therefore, I believe that having you and others like you share your experience is more powerful in getting the legislation to understand the issues, the concerns, but also the solutions to our problems. And so I'm going to volunteer you for things.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I think someone already has a mic.
Oh, yeah, this is a follow-up to an earlier question about the whole intake process abroad. And I was wondering how that has been impacted in different places by conflict. For instance, I've heard about refugees having trouble getting out of Yemen because there's no place to go. There are many. There was mention of large numbers of refugees being housed in Iran. Presumably, those people have no means of making it to an American embassy and so forth.
Well, I can say from my perspective that so we went from, when President Obama left the office, the ceiling was set at 100,000 people. Yeah, was it? Yeah. Oh no, 110,000 refugees for that year. There are these processing centers overseas that were equipped to handle that processing, right? So there was enough capacity to handle that much. When President Trump took office, they slashed that number to 50,000 right away, and then by the time he left the office, the ceiling was at 10,000. Can you imagine? 10,000 is what Texas gets on an average. Not even a year, I don't even think. I think they get much more. So 10,000. With that, the capacity overseas was completely dying, right? Because it was killed. There was no, I mean, you're not gonna keep 20 staff to process 20 people, right? So then COVID hit. All these things took place, and then Afghanistan happened. Ukraine happened. All these things are happening. They're putting a lot more pressure on receiving countries like the United States. And so there are some priorities, some natural priorities that you can see in that, and then that capacity is still being rebuilt. So I think there's a number of factors that are playing a role in these centers overseas operating. I'm sure my colleague has more insight, but that's from my perspective and from what I know.
In many areas, like refugees in Iran, Yemen, and some part of Africa, even within Latin America, it is impossible for them. Many of them, they are kind of facing a very tall wall in front of them, and there is no way to vet them. In the case of Afghanistan, we have 70,000 people eligible for a special immigration visa. We don't have facility down there. They have to travel to Pakistan or India or some other countries, and it is impossible. And even the intention that they are, if the Taliban authority knew that they are applying for such a visa, it will cost their life. And it is the same thing in Iran, and it is the same thing in Yemen. And Yemen is one of those countries that the indigenous population and their refugees and displaced are so neglected, they are so locked, and they cannot get out and go anywhere. And the number of infant mortality and maternal mortality is just sickening. And it is similar issue. So refugee resettlement is not a solution. It is just a temporary effort in order to help some. As I showed you on the slide, a very teeny tiny portion of the global refugee seeking asylum. The absolute majority of them want to go back. And it is our job, in order to, this is my argument, in order to bankrolling our engagement in some of these conflicts and wars. If we can invest in the sustainable development program and projects through the USAID, through the State Department, and through many other institutions that we have. And also support National Endowment for Democracy, USAIP, and so many other institutions we have at the national level and international level through many of the UN agencies. We can reach out to many of them and provide the needed resources in form of job training, environmental issue. It takes really not too much. So that is the way forward. If that hasn't been pushed forward, and if we cannot find an alternative for engaging in the conflicts and the foreign wars, foreign conflict and foreign war, through conflict management effort, and not reducing the level of geopolitical violence, it is too high now. It is too dangerous. God forbid if the escalation of war in Ukraine spread, and and the possibility of spreading is very significant. And even I have friends, they call me, what the hell are you doing in Europe? Come back. There is possibility of the usage of tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And I have been in a number of fundraising for the Ukrainian civilian efforts, especially in the medical area. It just breaks your heart. And I have friends and colleagues from Ukraine. And so the number of Ukrainians are dying, a number of Russians are dying. It is significant. To what end? So these are the kind of conflicts that produced this 100 million population, 100 million people across the globe. And they are wandering. And the majority of them cannot go back. And a fraction of them may or may not land in our communities. But refugee resettlement is not a solution. We have to have a different approach in our foreign policy, and the resources that we need at home that needs to stay at home. And this doesn't mean that the Department of Defense or our men and women in services are mistreated in this kind of conversation. They have done their job more than we asked for. As I've mentioned at the dinner table, in North Carolina, I visited one of the families for 6 years ago. One son was killed in Iraq, the others killed in Afghanistan. So when we were sitting on the dinner table, there were 2 empty chairs. And the uncle tried to ask me, so what is the result? Think about what they feel now, what's going on in that family. After what had happened in Afghanistan, the hotline within the Veteran Administration went to the roof. It just caused so much trauma and mental anguish across the veteran communities who have served for 20 years. I mean, if you had a child in 2001, now it is a 20-year man. And they are asking these questions to themselves and to authority, and that is, war causes a lot of anguish. It damages. You have seen 400 Syrians were killed. And Ukrainian, I do believe it is over 100,000 people were killed already within 1 year. It is too much for a country. 12 million people are displaced. And about a country has only 40 million people. In the case of Syria, for instance. After all, who will pay for reconstruction of these countries? On the top of that, within the deficit that we have, national deficit and national debt in the United States, which is over close to $40 trillion, with the federal government budget of $1.7 trillion, who will pay for the debt? How we pay for the interest? We owe to Chinese almost $1 trillion. The money that we borrowed and invest in these conflicts. So it must be, it requires every one of these, our citizens, every one of us, to think twice. In the case of Afghanistan, when was the last time your representative from the US Congress came to your town hall and gave you a report? And you should ask, how come after 20 years everything collapses? You should ask why we allowed the Taliban to take control of $83 billion worth of weapon system. So I stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Before we all head on our way, we do have copies of the Consequence Journal for sale in the back. And Niamat, can you just very quickly tell us what that is?
The journal is actually produced by a Consequence Forum, originally established by George Kovach, who was a Vietnam veteran and suffers from PSD. And so over the time, this journal became the front line of presenting arts, literature. It is a literary journal that bring the perspective and the experiences of combatants, victims, and witnesses. It is fun to read. Volunteer editors, and these are professional editors that work in editing, and we have received, I'm on the board of directors of this organization, and we received last year over 600 poems, short stories, and illustration of art, both fiction and non-fiction. And it is really fun to read. It gives you really a sense of what's going on. It relates you through art and literature. And there are copies here you can take with you. But please, they are also for sale. Send it to us. And you can donate about $20 a piece through their website. And the information is on the journal as well.
So if you don't have cash with you tonight, you can still take a journal, and then we will take your email address and send you the information on how to make the donation to the Consequence Forum online. And for anybody who is watching on YouTube, send an email to info@whips.org if you'd like a copy, and we'll make sure that you get one. Our next event will be 2 weeks from today. It's going to be a panel discussion featuring a lot of people who are here who have been working with the newcomers, and we hope to see you then. And please join me in thanking our wonderful guests.